right, so are you ready for this? We're going on a deep dive into a smartphone that you might not have expected. The Alcatel Idol 4S from way back in 2016.
Oh, wow.
Okay, yeah. We found this in-depth review over at RechargeMyTopup.com, and we're going to break down what made this phone tick, especially back then, 2016.
Yeah, 2016 was an interesting time for smartphones.
Yeah.
The big players were, starting to really kind of flex their muscles. But there was still room for some, unexpected innovation, especially in the mid-range market.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's exactly where this Alcatel comes in. But before we get into specs and all that jazz, let's talk about the packaging for a second. Are you ready for this?
Okay.
The box that it came in actually transformed into a VR headset.
Whoa, really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty clever.
Pretty neat, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a pretty clever move on Alcatel's part. VR was gaining some traction back then, but dedicated headsets were still pretty pricey. So by bundling a basic viewer, they were essentially giving people an entry point into VR without, breaking the bank.
Yeah, that's true. It was a pretty unique approach.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the phone itself for a second.
Yeah.
We're looking at a 5.5-inch AMOLED screen, which was pretty generous for a mid-ranger back then.
Yeah.
Especially, remember, even the iPhone was still rocking a 4.7-inch display.
Yeah, very small.
Yeah.
Right, and they paired that with a Snapdragon 652 processor, 3 gigabytes of RAM, and 32 gigabytes of storage expandable with a microSD card. So you have to remember, flagships were just starting to push toward 4 gigabytes of RAM. And expandable storage was still a big deal for a lot of users. So Alcatel is definitely hitting that sweet spot for budget-conscious consumers.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of hitting the sweet spot, let's talk about the camera for a sec. It boasted a 16-megapixel rear camera and an 8-megapixel front camera with a wide-angle lens. Perfect for those group selfies that were just starting to become a thing.
Yeah.
The review raves about the camera. But did Alcatel actually deliver in this department?
Actually, yes. They were punching above their weight compared to other mid-rangers. While the big names were obsessed with megapixel counts, Alcatel included features like phase detection autofocus, which helps the camera lock onto subjects faster, and a dual-tone LED flash on the rear camera for more natural-looking colors, and that wide-angle lens on the front. Definitely ahead of the curve for group selfies.
Oh, nice. Now, I know you're an audiophile, so this next part might intrigue you. The Idol 4S had dual stereo speakers enhanced with Waves audio technology, and they even threw in some JBL earbuds.
Nice.
Break this down for us. Was this Waves audio thing just a marketing gimmick, or did it actually make a difference?
No, this wasn't just a marketing ploy. Waves is a well-respected name in professional audio, so their software helps enhance sound clarity and loudness, and it likely made a noticeable difference compared to other phones in its class. Partnering with JBL for the earbuds was a smart move, too. A brand name like that could really influence potential buyers.
Yeah, it definitely adds a touch of prestige to the whole package. And all of this was wrapped up in what the review describes as a sleek and premium look with a glass front and back and a metal frame.
Mm-hmm.
Now, were they trying to make this phone look more expensive than it was?
Well, glass and metal were becoming the go-to materials for, premium phones.
Mm-hmm.
But you didn't see it too often in the mid-range category back then.
Right.
So yeah, the Idol 4S probably did give off a more high-end vibe than its price tag would suggest, especially since some manufacturers were still using a lot of plastic, even on their flagship models.
It's funny how the materials they use can really date a phone, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
But let's talk about a feature that hasn't aged quite as gracefully. Battery life.
Mm-hmm.
The Idol 4S had a 3,000 mAh battery, which the review calls decent but not exceptional, especially for heavy users.
Yeah.
And no fast charging either.
Oh, that's rough.
So,
yeah, battery tech has come a long way since 2016.
Yeah.
Back then, 3,000 mAh was considered pretty average for a mid-ranger, so it would probably get you through a day with moderate use.
Yeah.
But if you were constantly on your phone, you definitely need to top up.
Yeah.
And fast charging was still in its early stages, mainly found on the more expensive flagships.
It's amazing how much our expectations for battery life have changed, right?
For sure.
Nowadays, anything less than 4,000 mAh feels almost unusable.
Right.
But before we jump ahead too far, let's stick with what was important back in 2016. One last thing the review mentions is the phone's clean and easy-to-use interface, suggesting it was a good choice for those who weren't as tech-savvy. Did Alcatel make a conscious effort to simplify the Android experience, do you think?
It's possible. In 2016, Android user interfaces were still kind of all over the place.
Right.
Some manufacturers were adding all sorts of bells and whistles, which could be confusing for some users. If Alcatel kept things simple and close to stock Android, that would have been a big selling point, especially for people who just wanted a phone that worked without a lot of fuss.
So it sounds like the Alcatel Idol 4S was trying to offer a premium experience at a mid-range price with a few innovative features thrown in for good measure. But how did all of this actually play out in the market? Was it a success story or just another phone lost in the shuffle? That's what we'll be unpacking next.
Right on. All right. Well, you have to remember the smartphone market in 2016 was a different beast.
Yeah.
The mid-range segment was becoming increasingly competitive.
Right.
And while the Idol 4S had its strengths, it also faced some, pretty stiff competition.
Okay, so let's break down where the Idol 4S stood in the market. It had that unique VR feature.
Yeah.
But was that enough to make it stand out from the crowd?
It definitely helped with the initial buzz. I mean, it was pretty innovative to bundle a VR headset with a mid-range phone, but the experience was still fairly basic back then.
Yeah.
Those cardboard viewers were a far cry from the sophisticated VR headsets we have today.
Right. Yeah. I remember those early VR days. Blurry visuals, clunky controls. It was more about the novelty than anything else. But what about the phone's performance? How did that Snapdragon 652 processor and 3 gigabytes of RAM stack up against the competition?
It was considered decent for a mid-ranger at the time, so it could handle everyday tasks like browsing email, social media without much trouble. But if you were like a power user, someone who liked to play graphics-intensive games or multitask heavily, you might have hit some limitations.
So not exactly a powerhouse, but sufficient for the average user. What about that camera? Did it live up to the hype?
Here's the thing about smartphone cameras. It's not just about the megapixels. A lot of it comes down to the image processing software, and that's where the bigger brands with more resources had an edge. The Idol 4S could capture some decent shots in good lighting, but it struggled in low-light conditions.
So maybe not the best choice for budding photographers. But what about those dual stereo speakers enhanced by Waves audio? Was that a major selling point?
I think it was a smart move by Alcatel. Remember this was before Bluetooth speakers and headphones became ubiquitous?
Right.
People were actually using their phones to listen to music.
Yeah.
And those front-facing speakers made a big difference.
Yeah, that's something we totally take for granted now.
Oh, yeah.
If you wanted good sound back then, you're pretty much stuck with your phone's built-in speakers. But how did that 3,000 milliamp battery hold up? Was it enough to get through a full day of use?
Again, it depends on your usage patterns. If you were a light user, you could probably stretch it to a full day.
Right.
But heavy users would definitely need to top up, especially if they were using features like GPS or streaming video.
And no fast charging to save the day, right?
Nope. Fast charging was still a premium feature back then, so you had to be patient when it came to juicing up your Idol 4S.
So the Alcatel Idol 4S had its pros and cons. It offered a taste of the premium experience at a mid-range price, but it also had to make some compromises. But the bigger question is, how did this phone actually perform in the market? Did it make a splash, or did it just quietly fade away?
Well, it's hard to say for sure without access to sales figures,
Right.
But based on what I've seen, the Idol 4S didn't exactly set the world on fire. It garnered some positive reviews, but it didn't become a mainstream hit.
So why do you think that is? Was it simply outmatched by the competition?
I think it was a combination of factors. The mid-range market was becoming incredibly crowded with brands like Motorola and HTC were releasing some really compelling devices.
Yeah.
The Idol 4S was a good phone, but it didn't necessarily have that wow factor that would make it stand out from the pack.
You mentioned brand recognition earlier. Do you think that played a role?
Absolutely. Alcatel was known for budget-friendly phones, but they didn't have the same brand cachet as a Samsung or an Apple.
Yeah.
Consumers were often willing to pay a premium for a phone from a more established brand.
So it seems like the Alcatel Idol 4S was a case of good timing, good features, but maybe not enough brand recognition to truly capitalize on the opportunity. It's a story we see play out time and time again in the tech world, isn't it?
It is. Sometimes a great product isn't enough. You need a combination of factors, the right features, the right price, the right marketing, and a little bit of luck to truly succeed.
All right, well, we've taken a good look at the Idol 4S's place in the 2016 market. But now I'm curious, with all the advancements we've seen in smartphones since then, where does the Idol 4S stand today? Would it still be a viable option, or is it just a fascinating relic of a bygone tech era?
Yeah, it really is fascinating to think about how quickly technology evolves.
Oh, yeah.
What was considered cutting edge just a few years ago can seem almost quaint today.
Right. So if we were to take the Idol 4S out of its 2016 time capsule and drop it into the present, how do you think it would hold up?
Well, it would definitely be a bit of a culture shock. I mean, think about how much we rely on our smartphones today.
Right.
We're constantly streaming videos, playing games, using social media, and those activities demand a lot more processing power and battery life than they did back in 2016.
So are you saying that the Idol 4S wouldn't even be usable today?
Not necessarily. For basic tasks like making calls, sending texts, checking email, it would probably still function.
Right.
But you'd definitely notice a difference in performance, like apps would load slower, multitasking would be a challenge, and that 3,000 milliamp battery wouldn't last you very long.
Yeah. And I can only imagine what trying to run a modern VR app on that cardboard headset would be like.
Yeah, that's probably not the best idea. But there's something charming about the simplicity of those early VR experiences.
Yeah.
It was also new and exciting, and it didn't require a ton of expensive equipment to get started.
Yeah. I kind of miss those days sometimes. Everything feels so complicated now. But that's progress, I guess.
Speaking of progress, it's amazing to think about how far camera technology has come.
Oh.
Those 16 megapixel and 8 megapixel cameras on the Idol 4S were pretty impressive back then. But they wouldn't exactly hold up against today's multi-lens setups with computational photography and AI enhancements.
Not even close.
You think?
Smartphone cameras have become so sophisticated.
Yeah.
They're practically rivaling professional-grade cameras in some cases.
Yes.
And that's all thanks to advances in image sensors, processors, and software algorithms. The Idol 4S wouldn't stand a chance.
So it seems like the Alcatel Idol 4S might not be the most practical choice for a daily driver in 2023. But maybe it could still find a home as like a backup phone or even just a cool piece of tech history to show off to your friends.
Absolutely. It's a reminder of how far we've come in such a short amount of time.
Yeah.
And who knows? Maybe in a few years we'll be looking back at our current smartphones with the same sense of nostalgia. Well, I hope my battery lasts that long. But seriously, I think it's important to appreciate these older devices. They represent a specific moment in time.
Yeah.
And they played a role in shaping the technology we use today.
I completely agree. And there's something to be said for the simplicity of these older phones.
Yeah.
They weren't bogged down with all the bloatware and notifications that we have today. Sometimes I miss the days when a phone was just a phone.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe there's a lesson to be learned there. Maybe we need to be more mindful of how we use our technology and make sure it's actually serving us, rather than the other way around.
That's a great thought to leave our listeners with. What do you think? Would you trade in your current smartphone for a simply less demanding device? Let us know on social media.
And that wraps up our deep dive into the Alcatel Idol 4S. We hope you enjoyed this journey back to 2016 and that it sparked some interesting thoughts about the evolution of technology and our relationship with our devices.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the world of tech.